It's also reacted to, in addition to that bigger than expected number, was the larger than expected increase in average hourly earnings, which were expected to rise zero point 0.3, which would have been a smaller rise than the zero point 0.4, which was originally reported for the increase in the prior month. Well, that number was revised to up zero point 0.5, and the November number came out at zero point 0.6, double what had been estimated, and actually 50% above the upper end of the range of estimates, which went from a low of zero point 0.3 to a high of zero point 0.4. And year over year, average hourly earnings, which were expected to rise by 4.6, and which would have been a slight reduction from the up 4.7 from the prior month. Instead, we revised the prior month to up 4.9, and November, instead of going down, it rose to up 5.1%. So a big increase in average hourly earnings, both on the month and year over year. And that sent the chill through the market that the Fed would now have to be tighter with its monetary policy because inflation was getting worse due to increased pressure from rising reality. It's not rising wages that are going to cause higher inflation. It is higher inflation that is causing wages to rise. Wages are just a price, the price of labor, just like every other price, and prices are going up because of inflation. Rising prices don't cause inflation, they result from inflation. Time jobs. According to the household survey, we've added 190,000 new part-time workers since March, and 291,000 workers now have multiple jobs who didn't have multiple jobs prior to March, now have multiple jobs today. And in fact, I believe that net, all of the 2.7 million jobs that have been added since March either don't exist at all, in which case they're just fantasy jobs, or to the extent that they do exist, and a lot of them likely do, they are part-time jobs, and they went to people who already had jobs. So this is not new workers entering the labor force. In fact, again, the labor force continues to shrink. Another 186,000 people left the labor force in November. And in fact, the number of working age people who are no longer in the labor force rose by 359,000 in November, and we're now back over 100 million Americans who could be working who aren't. So the bitter irony of the November jobs report is that we didn't create 260,000 jobs because the economy is strong. We created those jobs because the economy is weak. And these new jobs don't indicate a strong labor market, they indicate a weak labor market. Why were these jobs created? Because people who already had jobs couldn't afford to pay the bills with the jobs they had. Their wages were falling in real terms, and so they needed another job to make up the loss. And so they took a second job, or they took a third job. This is not unemployed people returning to work. This is people who are already working being forced to work harder, being forced to take multiple jobs and spend more of their time working and have less time for leisure, less time with their families. This is not strength, this is weakness. In a strong labor market, you only need one job. In a weak labor market where wages are falling, that's when you need multiple jobs. And of course, in July of 2005, the reason Americans weren't saving is because they were so flush with home equity. Everybody thought they were rich because that was the peak of the housing bubble. And so people weren't saving, they were splurging. They had no idea that a great recession and financial crisis was just a few years away. But fast forward to 2022, when we are just entering a recession where millions of Americans are about to lose their jobs, they have no savings to fall back on. And not only do they have no savings, but they already have record credit card debt. Credit card debt right now is at an all-time record high. So Americans are about to lose their jobs with no savings and maxed out on their credit cards. But making the situation even worse is that homeowners are about to lose their home equity because real estate prices are about to drop sharply given both the surge in one, but the cost of living is going to be soaring as they've lost their paychecks, and their unemployment benefits are not going to come close to making up for what they've lost from their paychecks. But what those unemployment benefits will do is fuel the fires of inflation, because where is the government going to get the money to pay all these unemployed workers benefits? Going to be printed. The Fed's going to create this money, which is why I am still convinced that by 2023, the Fed's helicopters are going to be back in full flight. Quantitative tightening is going to be a thing of the past, and a brand new QE program is going to be launched, but it's going to be launched with high inflation, not low inflation. The Fed's going to pivot, even though it's not even close to its 2% inflation objective. And why is the Fed going to pivot? Because the recession that we are already in is going to get much worse. In fact, it may even morph into a financial crisis, and the Fed will be forced to abandon its inflation fight in order to fight what it believes to be an even larger threat in the economy. But the negative consequences of the higher inflation will play out later in time than would the consequences of continuing to fight inflation in the face of a massive recession. And we know from past experience that expedience is more important to the Fed, that it would rather kick the can down the road and make the problems worse rather than try to actually solve the problems, because it makes the immediate economic situation more painful. But getting back to some of the economic data that came out on Thursday, the situation is already getting more painful right now. Construction spending in the month of October dropped more than expected. The consensus was for a decline of 0.1. Instead, we dropped by 0.3, and the year-over-year increase is now just 9.2 versus the prior month's 10.9. But you have to keep this 0.3% decline in construction spending in its proper context, because the cost of construction is skyrocketing. Building costs, labor costs have gone way up. So the fact that spending is down means construction is way down, because the price of what is being constructed has gone up dramatically. So that means that the actual volume of construction is collapsing, because if construction continued at its prior pace, construction spending would be soaring. But it's not. Even though it's more expensive to build, the total amount of money spent building is going down. And that's because the volume of building is collapsing. And this collapse in construction spending is a function of the weak housing market, which is soon going to deprive so many Americans of their home equity. And don't make the mistake like Jerome Siegel is making, that falling home prices mean inflation is coming down. They don't. Inflation is going to keep going up because, as I've said many times, the price of the house means nothing. It's the cost of owning the house that's important. And even as home prices are going down, the monthly mortgage payments to buy that home are going up. But if you already own your home, what's important is not the price to buy one, but the cost of maintaining it, the cost of living there. And there, the costs are surging. The utility cost, the insurance cost, the maintenance cost, the taxes. In fact, someone sent me an email which contained a copy of their fire insurance for the complex that they lived in, which was a shared cost among all of the homeowners in this community. And 2 years ago, the total cost for the fire insurance policy was about $300,000. Now it's about $2 million. You're talking about a massive increase in the cost of insurance. And there are two reasons for that increase. One is big losses from the insurance companies having covered prior fires, because this policy is being written out in the Lake Tahoe area of California where there were a lot of fires. But also, if a house burns down, the cost of rebuilding it is now so much higher because of increased construction costs, and all that has to be built in to the premiums for fire insurance. And so these costs are going way up for people who live in. After I observed the way the markets reacted to Powell's very hawkish speech about inflation and how committed the Fed was to bringing it down, and how there was no evidence whatsoever that there was any headway being made in the fight against inflation. And so the Fed was going to have to raise rates higher and keep them higher longer. I thought these were fighting words from the Fed, and the markets just didn't buy what Powell was selling, because we had a fall in the dollar and a rise in the price of gold in the face of that speech. And I said, to me, that was convincing evidence that the markets had changed, and it didn't really matter now what Powell said, because investors know that he's all bark and no bite. And in fact, we had some real follow-through on Thursday. Gold prices shot up again, better than $20. In fact, we closed Thursday above $1,800 in the price of gold, and silver was even stronger, and the US dollar continued to fall. In fact, on Thursday, we closed below 105 on the US dollar index, and I have been talking about 105 as a key level for the US dollar from a technical perspective. Now, after we got the jobs number, we saw gold giving back a good chunk of those gains and the dollar recovering some of those losses, but then the markets reversed and the dollar sold off, and the dollar index closed negative on the day, and gold recovered almost all of its losses. It still managed to close down a couple of bucks just below 1,800, but silver actually finished the